Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Don Wolfensberger. I direct this Congress seminar series, and I'm your moderator today. We are shortly going to suspend my introductions and yield to our President and Director, Jane Harmon, who will be here momentarily. But before I introduce her, I would like to invite to the podium the president of the National Capital Area Political Science Association, Francis Lee. As I say, they are co-sponsoring today's event, and we're pleased to have them here as our guests. And Francis, if you just say a few words. By the way, I wanted to put in a plug for a book that is doing very well right now by Francis called Beyond Ideology, Politics, Principles, and Partisanship in the U.S. Senate. And we might hear more about that later today. But Francis, the podium is yours.
Thanks very much to Don Wolfensberger and the Congress Project at the Woodrow Wilson Center for organizing a panel on this important and timely topic. The National Capital Area Political Science Association is proud to co-sponsor this event, and we thank the panelists for what I'm sure will be an interesting and illuminating discussion. Ever since the 1970s, there's been an ongoing debate in academia about the extent and nature of Congress's influence over foreign policy. One line of argument made most famous by Arthur Schlesinger has argued that the presidency has become imperial over foreign policy with the growth of the national security state, a divided and ineffectual Congress, and the mushrooming use of classification to control policy information. What remains of the constitutional system of checks and balances in a world where few, if any, members of Congress can be fully informed about the issues, and where the president does not need to consult Congress before moving troops or launching missiles. Another line of argument, however, views the presidency as naturally superior in this area and uniquely well suited to respond to crises that have continually developed both during the Cold War and now in the post-9/11 environment. A slow-moving, deliberative body like the U.S. Congress is simply not in a good position to lead. Finally, there's been a resurgence of academic scholarship demonstrating the many ways in which Congress is able to remain relevant and influential in this area, even despite its many and obvious institutional weaknesses. Congress's capacities for investigation and for executive branch oversight, for public agenda setting, and for shaping and crystallizing public opinion should never be underestimated, even while the presidency has come to dominate in terms of formal authority. So in a contemporary environment in which it's become increasingly difficult for the Congress and the President to work together on any issues, what role can and should Congress play in the making of American foreign policy? I very much look forward to the insights that our panel today can provide on these central issues and questions.
Thank you. Now please join me in welcoming to our podium the President and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Honorable Jane Harmon.
Thank you, Don. I don't know why I'm needed here. I'm just a recovering politician along with Sununu. But I think this is a very important topic. I was thinking back over the 9 terms I served in Congress. 17 years is 119 dog years, for any of you who want to do the math. And the different wars we got into and the different ways they were authorized. From Bosnia in 1995 to Iraq to Afghanistan, in the reverse order, and more recently to Libya when I was no longer there. But each time, Congress's role seemed to me to be somewhat different, and the formal or informal justification seemed to be somewhat different. And it is really important to probe this subject because, so far as I know, the Constitution hasn't changed all these years, and it's still Congress's job to declare war. I've just come to listen up. There are very smart people on this panel, and also to say to everyone that John Sununu and I served together on the House Commerce Committee 1,000 years ago. Those were the days when there was some bipartisanship. I know most of you can't remember that was ever true, but it was true. And he and I worked together then, and we have worked together since. And the Woodrow Wilson Center, which I am now enormously honored to lead, is absolutely committed, at least here in this one wing of the Reagan building, to fostering thoughtful conversation, respectful interaction, and bipartisan solutions to tough problems. And one of them, obviously, is what role Congress should play as we confront very different challenges in foreign policy, some of them involving kinetics in the 21st century. So I just want to thank you for doing this panel. Give Sununu an actual hug, and welcome our audience.
Thank you, Jane. Today's program is the first in a series of programs in the coming academic year on the overall theme of Congress and global challenges. We're grateful to Chevron for its support in helping to make this series possible. But we thought it would be advisable to kick off the series with an overview of the subject by looking at Congress and foreign policy generally, hence our title, Congress's Influence on Foreign Policy, for better or worse, ? Some have suggested that we should have added another marriage vow for rich or for poor, but I think the State Department and others in the foreign policy area are already feeling that sting and know which direction some things are going, unfortunately, budgetarily. Many Americans think that foreign policy is the exclusive prerogative of the President and are sometimes annoyed that Congress should even presume to interfere with those prerogatives. In fact, that's what Woodrow Wilson thought as an academic when he wrote the following: "The initiative in foreign affairs which the President possesses without any restriction whatever is virtually the power to control them absolutely," end quote. And as we recall from his unyielding fight with the Senate over the Treaty of Versailles, 1919-1920, he still largely had that attitude when he was president. And yet the founders very much had Congress in mind as a player in foreign affairs when it gave it exclusive powers to declare war, regulate commerce with foreign nations, define and punish felonies on the high seas, offenses against the laws of nations, impose duties, imposts, and excises, and regulate the value not only of U.S. currency but of foreign currency, something very much in the news these days. I think Gail Shadegg is going to have a little more to say on that. The Senate, of course, has shared powers with the President on ambassadorships and treaties. Most fundamentally, of course, Congress's power of the purse goes not only to domestic matters but to foreign and military affairs as well. I was just thumbing through the 286 pages of the House Foreign Affairs authorization for foreign relations, and it covers a lot of territory, believe me, and I think they considered about 77 amendments during their markup during July. But notwithstanding these separate and shared powers and the intent of the framers that Congress should act as a check on the executive branch, both at home and abroad, Congress has tended to defer more and more to the President in this since the U.S. became an international power in this last century. And when it does get involved in making foreign policy, it is often accused of micromanaging, of excessive meddling in sensitive affairs. I recall very vividly former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and I believe he said this after he left office, of course, when he said that Congress's role in foreign policy is a little like 535 ants floating down the river on a log, each thinking it is steering the thing. Turns out I learned later that was a paraphrase of something Mark Twain once said about bureaucracies and 5,000 ants floating down a river on a log. Nevertheless, Congress is organized to play a role in foreign and defense policy, foremost through its committee system, the Armed Services and Foreign Affairs Committees to authorize programs in those areas, Finance and Ways and Means Committees on trade matters, Appropriations Committees on the Foreign Operations and Defense Subcommittees to determine appropriate allocations in those areas. All of these committees and subcommittees consume a substantial amount of time and resources of committee members and their staff, and their products receive considerable debate and amendment activity on the floor of the House and the Senate. So clearly Congress is involved on an ongoing basis in the formulation, funding, and oversight of America's foreign policies. What we are asking today is whether that involvement is for better or worse. Does it enhance or detract from the quality and success of our foreign policies? Well, we have an excellent panel today to help answer those questions. You have the biographies before you in your handout, so I won't go into detail on each of them, but let me just list briefly who we're going to hear from so I don't interrupt the flow of their presentations. We're first going to hear from former Senator John Sununu of New Hampshire, who served 6 years in the House of Representatives, as Jane pointed out, and then 6 years in the U.S. Senate. In the House, he was especially active on budget matters, and in the Senate on Foreign Relations and the Armed Services Committee. We'll secondly hear from David McKean, who is currently a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center, a former foreign policy advisor, chief of staff, and then Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff director for Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts. He is, by the way, the author of a biography that I think you all would find interesting, a former FDR confidant and then top lobbyist Tommy the Cork Corcoran. We're very grateful to you, David, for your willingness to fill in and, at the last minute after the withdrawal from the program of Congressman Dick Gephardt, who had a last-minute scheduling conflict that came up. So we're just grateful to David. I gave him the option of just waiting until the discussion or saying a few words during the presentations, and he was kind enough to say that, all right, I worked on the Hill with you. I can BS as the best of the rest of them, so I'll fill in and do a few remarks too. So and then we will hear from James Lindsay, Senior Vice President of the Council on Foreign Relations, former National Security Staff Council staffer, and a political scientist and author and co-author of several books in the field, including the popular college text Congress and the Politics of U.S. Foreign Policy. So we're very grateful to you, James Lindsay, for being with us today. Finally, we'll hear from someone who I have imposed upon several times to be here just because she's one of my favorite journalists on Capitol Hill, and that's Gail Shattuck, who is with the congressional correspondent with the Christian Science Monitor. But prior to that, being a Hill correspondent with the Monitor, she had been their Paris bureau chief. So she's looked at this issue, I'd say, from both sides of this across the big body of water, and we'll be grateful to her for her insights. Prior to being a journalist, though, she taught political science at several colleges. So she is one of the people that I'm sure my former boss, Lynn Martin, would have been very proud to have worked with and known, because Lynn Martin was always saying, I wish those journalists would have at least been required to take one political science course during their college days, because some of them just don't know what's going on here. But after a few years, they do catch on. But with that, I'm going to yield the podium to Senator Sununu for such time as he may consume.
Thank you very much, Don. And let me be the first to recognize that yielding to a senator for as much time as they want is like the most dangerous thing you could possibly do in a format where you're trying to get to other speakers. But I will try to keep my remarks brief and focused on some of the peculiarities about Congress in general and the House and the Senate in particular, how they might contrast with one another, how members might arrive at their own decisions with regard to foreign policy, what kind of a perspective and background do they bring to their view of foreign policy, and how might it affect some of the outcomes. A few thoughts, though, about some of the comments that were made in the introduction. First, thank you very much to Jane for her kind words. Wonderful to work with her. She's a genuinely good friend and an extremely thoughtful person, and worked bipartisan way on a whole host of issues, but never more determinedly than on issues of national security and on the Intelligence Committee, which she was privileged to lead and did so very effectively. She mentioned bipartisanship, and I would start with an observation that there's plenty of bipartisan consensus with regard to foreign policy. Presidents, both Democrat and Republican, absolutely agree that Congress has no business meddling in foreign policy. Members of Congress, Democrat and Republican, join together in agreeing that the Oval Office, has no idea where they're going on foreign policy. So there is opportunity for members, the parties, to work together in that regard. With respect to the age of the debate, certainly the debate goes back further to the 1970s, although no question that academic circles, I think, have been more thoughtful and more focused on the give and take between Congress and the presidency since then. Don mentioned Wilson's perspective on the relative role of Congress versus the presidency back at the turn of the century, but the fact is some of the earliest and most heated debates in Congress were over matters of foreign policy, approval of treaties with the English, and not just arguing the substance and the detail and the meaning and the impact of what was written into those treaties, but arguing at the time about the broader role of Congress in foreign policy. So it's an issue that's been in front of the country since its founding, and there's no question that Congress has a role. It has a role by design. That's the way the framers wanted it. They could have simply written into the Constitution that on matters of foreign policy, Congress will butt out, but they didn't. There's no more important responsibility than the power to declare war. There's an incredibly important role that is clearly enumerated for the Senate to approve and ratify treaties. And in terms of relevance, we can look just to the past few weeks. Approval after a long delay of three relatively important trade agreements. And that some who were responsible for the delay might argue that it was done in order to ensure that both the treaties were well crafted in their detail and that additional issues like a trade adjustment authority were considered along with the treaties. And there's no question that if you're Korea, the delay and the details in that trade agreement have shaped your foreign policy choices and decisions with regard to the United States. So it may be simply a trade agreement, but there's no question it affects foreign policy. The Senate's approval of legislation dealing with Chinese currency manipulation is another very pertinent agreement. I mean, whether you agree or disagree with the legislation, there's no question that it is not just relevant, but very important to the shade and the tone of our relations, both economic, social, and political, with China. So there's no question that Congress it remains extremely relevant in this debate. I see, as a former member, the central tension between the presidency and Congress being that, in the abstract, I think most Americans would agree we would like a consensus-driven, unified foreign policy, because that's easier to implement. It's easier to represent our national interests if that's the case. But in fact, we have a Congress that's partisan at times and populist at times, and that can certainly be driven, because there are human beings in the Congress, by different aspects of ethnic or demographic identity. And none of those things in and of themselves are bad. I mean, parties aren't a bad thing. Parties help make our system of democracy work. Parties represent differing views and ideas about economics, about governance, and about foreign policy at times. So, you don't solve the problem by getting rid of parties. You don't solve the problems by telling people that, you really shouldn't identify yourself as an Irish American or a Scottish American or an Italian American or a Polish American. That's what America's all about. But you can't escape the fact that these things in turn, these American concepts in turn, affect the way a member of Congress, House or Senate, views their role and their responsibility. So what are the things that drive those members and their approach to foreign policy? Well, first is their personal background. Where did they grow up? What part of the country are they from? Where were they educated? How did their own family's view of their immigrant roots shape them and their value system as they grew up and got educated and began a pursuit of public life? That really does make a difference. If you're a first-generation Polish-American family, then you're probably going to be a little bit more focused on the issues associated with the Central Europe, with issues associated with our allies and adversaries in that part of the world. It's natural, not inevitable, but it's a very natural thing. There's no question the coasts, East Coast and West Coast, tend to be, the populations there, if you were to poll them, tend to be a little bit more focused on international issues. And I think that's as much a reflection of geography as anything. There are very few people in America, a few people, as a percentage, Americans are not nearly as focused on international issues as their counterparts in Europe. But that's really, again, a reflection of geography, of the size of countries, of the number of countries that somebody might have visited as they were growing up, and certainly in public life. So that background shapes members' perspective without question. Second would be constituencies. So regardless of your background, your upbringing, your ethnicity in the United States, if you're a member of Congress and you're representing a district, you care about the makeup of the people in your district. Where are they from? What parts of the world are they most focused on? Even if there's not a unanimity on a particular issue. If you are a member of Congress that represents Dearborn, Michigan, you will naturally have spent time in various parts of the largest Arab American community in the United States. And that's, without question, going to help inform your view, and might even have an effect on your priorities. And you can go district by district all over the country and find that constituencies might shape and affect the intensity with which a member of Congress looks at foreign policy in a particular part of the world. Committees. The committees you're on, it certainly has an impact. There's no question, if you're a member of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate or in the House, I think they call it International Affairs in the House, but they keep changing the names of these committees. You're going to be more focused on foreign policy. If you're the chairman of the Africa Subcommittee in the United States Senate, you're going to be more focused on issues affecting the African continent. It doesn't mean that you're going to disregard other parts of the world. And if you're a member of one of the the committees with foreign policy jurisdiction in the House or Senate, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be a good member. But it means that you're much more likely to be focused on those issues. And it's not just the Foreign Relations Committee, but the Armed Services Committee is going to bring members in closer contact with issues having to do with foreign policy and foreign affairs and international relations. The Homeland Security committees are going to bring members in closer contact with these issues and questions because of the amount of work that's being done around the world to try to deal with a threat from terrorism and other threats to us. So it's not just a Foreign Relations Committee, it's broadly all committees. And then the final point on committees is it matters who runs those committees. So again, if you're on the Armed Services Committee, John McCain and Senator Levin are going to have a different perspective on foreign policy and national security issues than Dick Lugar and John Kerry, their counterparts on foreign affairs in the Senate. Again, not necessarily better or worse, and whether issues are more partisan or less partisan, those four individuals are all deeply involved in foreign policy, but all carry with them their own biases and interests and areas of emphasis. So if you're a member on one committee, there's a greater likelihood that you would follow some of the leadership and the thought development of those leaders. And then the final thing that affects a member's perspective are events themselves. I didn't expect that I would be so involved in issues relating to Iraq as I ended up being when I was first elected to the House in 1996. If you had asked me sort of what issues of foreign policy are going to be important to you, you're going to spend time on, you're going to involve yourself in, where might you travel as a member of Congress, if you had asked me any of those questions in 1996, 1998, and 2000, when I was a member of the House, the answers I gave you would have bore no rhyme nor reason to what I was thinking and doing and working on in 2002 and 2004 and 2006 in the United States Senate. Not many members of Congress, having said all of that, pay a great deal of attention to foreign policy. And one of the prompts, the questions that we had to consider and preparing brief remarks for today was, well, how many members of Congress really pay attention to foreign policy? You've got to define pay attention, right? What does that mean? But, I think it's, 5 or 10%. And how I would define it would be how many members pay attention or work on foreign policy issues that aren't in the headlines. Work on foreign policy issues when others in the Senate are not working on them or paying attention to them. So we're all asked to deal with, you have to vote on a currency manipulation bill, or you have to vote on troop deployments or withdrawals from Iraq or from Afghanistan, or you have to vote on the foreign operations bill. We've all been through that, and most members pay attention and consider and analyze and come to their own decisions when it's time to vote on those. But who works on foreign policy issues when that's not happening or when that's not in the headlines? And it's probably 5 or 10%, to be quite blunt and quite succinct. Should it be more? Yes, it should be. And the reason it should be more is because the more that members pay attention to foreign policy issues during the times that these issues are not in the headlines, the better prepared they will be to respond and react to challenges when they do become a crisis situation. And that would really be a point that I would close on. So the question, well, how do you make the situation better? Right? What can we do to make the situation better? And it's a simple suggestion, and it's probably one that's been made many times before, but it's worth emphasizing because as a former member, I think it makes a difference. And that is to provide as many opportunities as possible domestically for members of Congress to debate and discuss these issues when they're not a crisis. So having a forum, say today, about troop deployment or withdrawal in Afghanistan is important, but the country would have been better served if people were talking about the nature of the Afghani state, its strengths and weaknesses, its failures, and opportunities to improve stability 10 and 15 years ago. And so the objective should be, whether it's the Wilson Institute or any other, Council on Foreign Relations was mentioned, any other, many outstanding institutions that care about international relations and foreign policy, you've got to work as hard as possible to provide those opportunities to debate and discuss. You might not draw as big a crowd if you're talking about the roots of democratic reform in sub-Saharan Africa. That might not be draw the crowd that a debate about troop policy in Afghanistan or Iraq, but it's going to be important, and it's always difficult to tell if and when we'll all be tuned into those questions and issues, but if and when we are. If there's a crisis on the world stage or an activity on the world stage, the U.S. stage, that causes us to turn to that issue, we'll be better off if people have spent a lot of time thinking about it, talking about it, discussing it out of the glare of the spotlight, because they'll be better informed, they'll be more capable, they'll be more confident, and they'll be able to bring something to the table that will really make a difference for their colleagues in the United States Congress. Thank you.
Interesting you should mention sub-Saharan Africa. I think over the weekend the word came out that President Obama had sent a letter to the Congress under the terms of the War Powers Act indicating he was sending 100 special service advisors into Uganda, and that he also planned in the near term to send them to, I think, both Sudan and Central African Republic and Congo.
Okay.
So this is just coming out in the news, but probably Congress hasn't paid that much attention. But again, this was under the terms of the War Powers Act, that we are involving U.S. military and some other countries in potential hostile situations. With that, I'll turn things over to David McKean. You may use the podium if you wish.
Thank you. I think Don mentioned that I've dabbled a little bit in history and that I spent quite a lot of my career working for John Kerry. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to dabble in a little history and tell you a little bit about John Kerry. As an example of somebody whose career in foreign policy, I think, is illustrative of a lot of what goes on in the Congress. So what about it? Is Congress a positive influence on foreign policy? And I think before answering that question, we have to keep in mind that any influence Congress has derives from the Constitution, as the senator said. And one political observer, I think, put it very well. He said, quote, "The making of a sound U.S. foreign policy depends on a vigorous, deliberative, and often combative process that involves both the executive and legislative branches. The country's founding fathers gave each branch both exclusive and overlapping powers in the realm of foreign policy, according to each one's comparative advantage, inviting them, as one constitutional scholar has put it, to struggle for the privilege of directing American foreign policy." But let's be clear, for most of our nation's history, and I think certainly in the modern era, it hasn't been that much of a struggle. The president's been the driver of foreign policy. The president has the vision. He sets the agenda. He sets the tone. He appoints the people to implement his vision. And some will argue that there is a key division of power over the question of war. The power to declare war was given to Congress, but the power to wage war remains with the president. And theoretically, of course, the president needs to get a declaration of war from Congress. But the last time Congress passed a bill with the title Declaration of War was in 1942. Since then, the U.S. has used terms like authorization to use military force, as it did in Iraq in 2003. Of course, once a war is underway, Congress has the power to stop it by cutting off funding. That happened in Vietnam. I think it's unlikely to ever happen again where U.S. troops are involved. But Congress hasn't always taken a back seat, and it will not always take a back seat. For instance, during the 1980s, President Reagan pursued a policy known as constructive engagement with South Africa. It was a policy of offering incentives to the South African government for eventual regime change. The United States provided economic and military aid to the South African government as they encouraged Prime Minister Botha of South Africa to implement reforms. However, Congress felt that the pace of reform was too slow, and in 1986 it passed over President Reagan's veto a bill imposing broad sanctions. So this shared responsibility, with the executive branch usually taking the lead, I think it generally works pretty well. But what, if anything, can Congress do to make it a more responsible player in foreign policy on a day-to-day basis? And from where I sat as a staffer at the Foreign Relations Committee, I believe the answer is oversight, 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 oversight. And let me read to you a paragraph from an article written by Norman Ornstein and Thomas Mann in Foreign Affairs a few years ago. Quote, "One of Congress's key roles is oversight, making sure that the laws it writes are faithfully executed and vetting the military and diplomatic activities of the executive. Congressional oversight is meant to keep mistakes from happening or from spiraling out of control. It helps draw out the lessons from catastrophes in order to prevent them or others like them from recurring. Good oversight cuts waste, punishes fraud or scandal, and keeps policymakers on their toes. The task is not easy. Examining a department or an agency, its personnel, and its implementation policies is time-consuming. Investigating possible scandals can easily lapse into a partisan exercise that ignores broad policy issues for the sake of cheap publicity." And I think that's exactly right. I would only add to this that members need to have the information to to assess the strategic viability and implications of any particular policy. And hearings are a really, really important part of this process, and too few members attend them. Too often, issues are decided without proper information or based on political considerations rather than being driven by substantive information and a critical assessment of the pros and cons. It's just too easy to politicize foreign policy as it is any issue. And take Pakistan. Congress should be explaining to the public in concert with the administration why we need to maintain a good relationship with Pakistan. That doesn't mean necessarily that the terms of the relationship remain static, but it does mean that we need to not only understand the failings of Pakistan, but we need to put them into a context of our historical relations with that country. And we need to do so in order to find common ground. Too often we see a relationship like this captured in knee-jerk political terms that ignore the foreign policy and national security implication. So that's a brief view of Congress and foreign policy from 50,000 feet, but let me now take a more granular look at how one committee and its chairman operate. As Don noted, I was the Chief of Staff to Senator Kerry from 2000 to 2008, and in 2009 he became chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. The senator had been on the committee since 1984 when he was first elected to Congress. His father had been a diplomat in the Foreign Service. And as you undoubtedly know, Senator Kerry served in Vietnam but later became a critic of the war. In 1972, he testified before the Foreign Relations Committee, where he famously asked the question, how do you ask a man to be the last to die for a mistake? And I'd seen the senator dive into any number of issues over the years that I worked for him, but foreign policy was always his great passion. And at the risk of stating the obvious, it's very, very different to be the chairman of a committee and not just one of its members, even one of its very senior and better-known members. As a member of the committee, Senator Kerry had 1, 2, maybe 2.5 staffers who were responsible for covering the issues for him. And you can't be an expert on every issue. There just isn't enough time in the day. So invariably, you distinguish yourself by focusing very intentionally on a niche or two. And this really goes to what Senator Sununu was talking about. Personal experience can help a member find his or her issue. In the early 1990s, Senator Kerry, for example, focused heavily on the recognition, transition, modernization issues related to Vietnam because he had served there and because he had previously chaired the POW investigation in the Senate. Subcommittee work can likewise help a member find their issue. Senator Kerry served as the senior Democratic member on the Asia Subcommittee, which partially explains why he worked on the Cambodia Genocide Tribunal. And finally, the opportunity to lead on an important issue can help a member emerge. In the late 1990s, Senator Kerry did a tremendous amount of work on AIDS in Africa, and it was a moral issue for him, but it was not a mainstream issue. And as I noted, in 2009, he became chairman of the committee, and suddenly he had to cover the world. He was responsible not only to members of his committee, but really to the entire Senate. And he had to be something of an expert on every issue that came up, and that means Afghanistan, Pakistan, Egypt, Libya. So just to put it in sort of very real terms, as a member of the committee, Senator Kerry probably spent 20% of his time on foreign policy. As chairman, he now spends 50% of his time on committee-related work. But I think the one thing that's really important here is that when he's not in the Senate, when the Senate is in recess, he spends a huge amount of his time on the road, traveling to such vacation spots as Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Middle East, and Darfur. As a son of a Foreign Service officer, he really believes that in order to understand a country, you have to know it. You have to make contact with the people. You have to visit and listen to foreign leaders. You have to see it for yourself. He used to say to me that good diplomacy requires the ability to see another country through their eyes and their history. And I think the foreign travel component is especially important to any chairman of a committee that handles foreign policy. After 2004, because Senator Kerry was known as a serious student of foreign policy and because he was famous globally as a former presidential nominee, he could get meetings with any foreign leader he wanted. and he developed some important relationships. But what changed in 2009 is that many of the leaders of these countries now see a chairman who is close to the president, and they look to him to translate the administration's foreign policy. But I should add, I think the senator has been smart about this. He recognized that he is a translator, and he's not a spokesman for the administration. He understands that Congress is a separate branch of the government. Indeed, he has differed with the administration on key issues, declaring in October 2009 that the president's strategy for Afghanistan went too far too fast, and this past summer publishing a report that was quite critical of our civilian assistance in Afghanistan. He's also found that as chairman he has a convening power that is extremely important, like bringing in former Republican secretaries of state and defense months ahead of the START treaty to set a bipartisan tone. But he also has a convening power with his own members, privately having committee members to his house to try to build relationships and to bridge partisan divides. I think that's a big part of why the committee has had some important bipartisan successes. And Senator Sununu alluded to this, but let me add that Senator Kerry has had a great partner in all of this, and that's Senator Richard Lugar. There are many times when Senator Kerry had to run off to another appointment, and he wasn't comfortable, and he was comfortable handing the gavel to Senator Lugar. I think more commonly on other committees you find the chairman and the ranking member actually wanting to throw the gavel at one another. The other thing or the last thing I'll sort of note about the Foreign Relations Committee is, and the senator's approach to it, is that he's wanted to make it clear that it's not a chairman-centric committee to the extent that that's possible. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think his personal experience here has been really instructive. He'd been on the committee for 24 years working on these issues, but with contemporaries like Chairman Biden and Senator Chris Dodd ahead of him in seniority. He'd spent most of his career in the third or fourth position, and that can be frustrating. So when he finally got the gavel, he thought about how to reinvigorate the subcommittees and empower committee members so that they felt engaged. He created a new subcommittee for Senator Boxer to pursue her passion on women's issues. He let subcommittee chairs chair major hearings. He reached out to new members, like Chris Coons, whose passion is Africa, and he empowered them to really lead on issues through their subcommittee. He knows that the committee only succeeds if the members on both sides feel that they get some real value for being on it, because it's not a committee that wins you a lot of votes back home. So let me stop there, but whether it's in the executive branch or in the Congress, I think in the final analysis, effective foreign policy is the byproduct of effective leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll turn things over to James Lindsay, who did his teaching at the University of Iowa a few years after I had left there as a graduate student, but I have very fond memories of the Iowa City campus. Jim?
Well, thank you very much, Don. I guess this is the point where I'm supposed to say "Go Hawks," which is the motto of the University of Iowa. Thank you very much for having me here. I want to say thank you to Congressman Harman, also say thank you to Francis Lee. I actually want to echo what Don said earlier. Francis has written an excellent book, and I would recommend that people not only read it but buy it, which is what every author wants readers to do. I also want to say it's an honor to be here with Senators Sununu and David and Gail, though I think I may owe Gail an apology in advance. I am a professor by training, and a professor is a job that was once defined as somebody who talks while other people sleep. And so I will endeavor to turn this panel over to you with the audience at least half awake. I believe the question I was asked to address is Congress's influence on foreign policy for better or worse. My answer, yes. I say that because questions about whether Congress's role in foreign policy is good or bad ultimately lies in the eye of the beholder. And essentially, people like Congress, when Congress is standing up to a president who's doing things they don't like, and they want Congress to sit down and be quiet when the president's doing what they want him to do. More, if you're a historian or a political scientist, you want to go back and pore through history trying to find examples of a good congressional influence on foreign policy or a bad congressional influence on policy, or whether an activist Congress is good and a deferential Congress is good. You can find multiple examples on both sides. I mean, if you want an argument against the deferential Congress, do what Arthur Schlesinger did, as Don mentioned earlier on. You can talk about the imperial presidency and Congress surrendering its voice and giving us the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. If you want an argument against an activist Congress getting away, a president doing the right thing, perhaps the classic example will be the Senate's rejection of the Treaty of Versailles. So what I like to do in my time here is actually talk about three different things or make three different points. One is that Congress operates at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the president in foreign policy, and it will continue to do so as long as the United States has an activist foreign policy. Second, politics inherently shapes what Congress does in foreign affairs. And number three, Congress influences foreign policy directly, but perhaps even more importantly, indirectly. Let me begin with my first point. Congress operates at a disadvantage in foreign policy and will so long as we have an activist foreign policy. As Don ably pointed out at the beginning, if you look at the Constitution clearly gives important foreign policy powers to both Congress and the President, so much so that there's a famous saying in constitutional circles that the Constitution is an invitation to struggle over foreign policy. Even so, ever since World War II, the playing field is tilted decisively in the favor of the White House. There are many reasons for that. I'll lay out three in particular. One, and the most important, is the changed U.S. role around the world. It produced very changed conceptions of presidential power. And maybe instructive here is to compare James Madison, who, among other things, actually helped write the Constitution and became president with more modern presidents. During Madison's presidency, the House of Representatives actually passed a bill delegating to him decision about whether to go to war with France. Madison argued that Congress could not constitutionally delegate that power because the war power belongs solely to Congress. Fast forward 1950, after the invasion, or North Korean invasion of South Korea, you had President Truman decide to send U.S. forces to Korea without requesting any authorization, whether labeled declaration of war or not. Moreover, he did so without going to Congress at the behest of congressional leaders, or today, President Obama in Operation Odyssey Dawn. Second point is that extensive overseas involvement in a huge national security establishment means that Congress must, by necessity, delegate authority to the White House, and it will have exceeding difficulties in oversight. We talked a little bit about oversight. But on both points, delegation and oversight, keep the following in mind. If you're Congress and you want to give authority to the president, generally you have to write it to give the president some leeway. If the law is too rigid, it will be counterproductive. One of my favorites was an appropriations rider back in the 1970s, which forbid aid to the Central African Empire. The problem was between the time the bill passed and went into effect, the Central African Empire collapsed. But all of a sudden, the United States government wanted to give aid to the successor government. It was barred by law from doing so. But obviously, as any of you know, when you delegate, you open the room for people to borrow the economist's favorite word, shirk, or that is, do what they want. Likewise, in terms of oversight, the national security establishment, Department of Defense, Department of State, Department of Treasury, intelligence community is huge. And it is very difficult to oversee. People like David very ably try to follow what those agencies do, but it is an extraordinarily daunting task. And I should also add, it's often difficult for the White House to oversee those very same agencies. Third thing is the courts sit on the sidelines on most foreign policy issues. When I taught, whether it's at Iowa or later when I taught at the University of Texas at Austin, hook 'em horns, I'm supposed to say there, what would happen is that students always thought, well, the courts will step in and referee the separation of powers. And as a practical matter, the courts decline to do so. During question and answer, if you want, we can talk about why that's the case. But the fact that the court is not sitting there sort of refereeing the contest between the president and the White House effectively advantages the White House for the reasons that Don noted when he quoted Woodrow Wilson. That is, the president can take the initiative and then require Congress to try to stop him. And indeed, in many respects in American politics, we really do have two presidencies. In domestic politics, the president frequently cannot act unless Congress agrees. Probably the most notable example recently would be the debt ceiling debate this summer. But in many areas of foreign policy, by no means all of them, presidents can act until Congress stops them. Congress does it, of course, by passing a law, but laws only become laws if the president signs it. If the president vetoes, it goes back to the Hill. And as long as the president can maintain the support of 34 senators, which generally speaking isn't that hard to do, a bill is veto-proof. And indeed, the last foreign policy bill to be vetoed and then have the veto overridden was the South African sanctions bill a quarter of a century ago. And likewise, just sort of coming more recently, when you think about President Obama in Libya, there was a great deal of sentiment in both chambers, but particularly in the House, to stop the president's decision on Operation Odyssey Dawn. But as a practical matter, everybody knew from the start that no bill compelling the president to stop the bombing was going to pass. Point number two, politics shapes congressional interest in foreign policy. Americans very much like to believe that politics stop at the water's edge. I actually write a blog called The Water's Edge at CFR.org. Yes, that is a blatant plug. But the fact is, politics doesn't stop at the water's edge, never has. If you go all the way back, we talked about earlier, most bitter disputes during George Washington's presidency came to deal with foreign affairs. Now, I'm not arguing that all foreign policy is about politics. Various committees, staff work very hard to try to oversee what the government does as part of their business. Likewise, as we just heard moments ago, individual members have their own policy platforms and things they're interested in and really do try to make a difference. I think that's actually generally easier to do in the United States Senate, which gives a little bit more free rein to members than the more regimented House does. But that said, politics to a great degree shapes, constrains, and drives what it is that Congress does in foreign policy and what it's interested in. When you think about sort of what might be the basic law of democratic politics, it is that lawmakers gravitate toward issues that voters care about. Or put it somewhat differently, squeaky wheels get the grease. So when the public is focused on jobs in the economy, lawmakers tend to be even more focused on jobs in the economy. When the public is solidly behind the president, as it was, let's say, in 2002, the fall of 2002, the public tends to rally behind the president. And going beyond that, we tend to get bipartisan politics when there's consensus in the public about what our policy should be, and our politics get to be very partisan when there's considerable difference in what the public wants and disagreement, not only just what we should be doing abroad, but what the solution to those problems are. Point three is that Congress influences foreign policy both directly, perhaps even more importantly, indirectly. We normally think of congressional impact on foreign policy in terms of what laws get passed. Did Congress forbid the president from doing X? Did the president compel the president to do Y? And some congressional legislation does really sort of specify the substance of foreign policy. Appropriations bills regularly contain provisions directing how money may be spent. We talked about the South Africa sanctions bill. But while a lot of focus is on direct substantive legislation, Congress's impact goes well beyond that. And Congress influences policy in two important ways indirectly. The first is through the passage of what's referred to as procedural regulation. That is, Congress has extensive foreign policy powers to write the rules of how the federal government operates. And historically, Congress has created offices in the executive branch when it believes an issue has not been attended to. One of the more recent ones was to create an ambassador for international religious freedom because of a concern that the administration was not paying enough attention to it. Likewise, on trade policy, Congress has mandated that the executive branch consult with all different kinds of groups as it develops policies. All these efforts at procedural legislation are predicated on the notion if you change how decisions get made or who has a say in the making of a decision, that you'll get a different outcome. But Congress or members of Congress also influence policy indirectly by trying to change the climate of opinion in the country and thereby put pressure on presidents to act or not act as the case may be. Speeches, television appearances, congressional hearings, op-eds, even dramatic stunts like going out on the grounds of Capitol Hill with a sledgehammer to break imported goods or to bring out a Christmas tree festooned with representations of defense cost overruns and things like that are all issues about trying to frame public debate, or if you want to be less charitable, political, and certain critics certainly do this, to argue that it's political grandstanding. But at the end of the day, it's about trying to shape the terms of the public debate to make some policies more likely, to make other policies less likely. Because at the end of the day, what Congress realizes, in part because actually passing a law is so difficult, part of the effort is aimed at trying to shape the calculations that the White House makes about what it's going to do, what it's likely to be able to accomplish on Capitol Hill, and what will cost it too much politically. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Gil Shattuck.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here today, especially because Don has helped me on more times than I can possibly recall, because this institution is one that provides something that Congress is very short on right now, and that is institutional memory, where you can just get a context or even a timeline or even ask the question, Don, is this some new thing or has this been going on for years? This is a place that remembers things. And switching to our topic today, foreign policy, to me it's critical to remember that Congress is not abstract. As Senator Sununu said, it's about people. And only 5 to 10% of the people are interested in foreign policy. David McKean said, we have hearings. Oversight is a critical function of Congress. Yes, it is. But if you actually look at hearing rooms, there are often just 1 or 2 people up there asking questions. They're largely empty. Why is that? Too few members attend them, David said. And the last comment I thought was the most poignant and the most important. He said, this great interest in foreign policy that some members of Congress have had in spades only succeeds if they get credit for it back home. Very important point. And finally, Mr. Lindsay was just talking about the Congress reflecting what the public is interested in, and that all of the kind of gimmicks, the Christmas trees, the smashing of imports, is a way to attract the public. What has struck me the most in the panel discussions is that no one has yet trashed the media, so let me do that. When I was in Paris, my favorite place to spend time was in a bookstore that was owned by an Iranian dissident who had been part of the revolution that brought Khomeini to power. He, of course, assumed that Khomeini would leave power very soon after that, which he never did. So he and a lot of his colleagues ended up fleeing for their life and winding up back in Paris. And I loved to talk to him about this. He would follow world affairs very closely and had a special interest in the United States, which he visited frequently. Last point to this long story. The last time I saw him, I asked him what he was encouraged with in the world, what concerned him, and he said that the thing that made him the most afraid in the world was the last time he saw CBS News. He had just come into the country, he turned on the news, and he noticed that there was only a minute and a half or 2 minutes devoted to foreign affairs, and he said, you are the world's superpower, and you are learning nothing about the world. You don't know anything about the world. You're not being given anything about the world. How can you possibly exercise that authority responsibly? Fair point. Now we go back to Congress. When I was an academic, I thought about Congress as an institution. When I cover it, it's impossible to not think about it as people. 535 people who have to make decisions about how they're going to use their own time and how they're going to use their resources. And lately, those decisions have less and less to do with foreign policy. Why is that? Because you can get hurt by being too interested in foreign policy. Because it is a template for a 2-second, 7-second ad. So-and-so cares more about people in fill in the blank than he does in the problems we're facing back home. This occurred to me recently as I was calling Senator Lugar's staff, which I do frequently for information on lots of things, especially where the senator is standing on a position. And I wish I could remember what I was calling him about. It would make this a better story. Something to do with weapons. Maybe it was Libya. And this excellent staff member said, the senator is at an ag fair in Indiana. And I thought he hadn't heard me, and I repeated the question again. He says, the senator is at an ag fair in Indiana, meaning don't ask me any foreign policy questions until November 2012. There's a very important race going on here, and we really don't want to look as if we're more concerned about something there than we are here. Well, that is just a small version of what I think is a much broader trend in Congress. I was jotting down as people were talking some questions that I would love answers to. Don collects lots of data, but not data on these points. I'd love to know the amount of time that a member of Congress can now spend in Washington, D.C. as opposed to home. I mean, my anecdotal sense is that Congress starts about 6 o'clock on Tuesday and ends about noon on Thursday. And if you get in the way of someone exiting the building Thursday at noon to make a plane, you are taking your life in your hands. So what happens in that small section of time when people are together and can actually talk and build relationships on issues like this? Well, look at any member of Congress. They carry laminated cards that are broken out in 15-minute intervals. There is time for committees, but not a whole lot. There are fundraisers in the evening. They don't have a lot of control over the time that they spend doing things, and that's had an impact on what we're talking about. Another question I'd love an answer to. If you look at the percentage of staff resources, how much is spent hiring and retaining staff that know something about policy, as opposed to staff that can man a war room, that are very good with their thumbs, that are texting, tweeting, establishing networks. I remember a conversation with a man who was regarded until he was let go as one of the most effective staff PR people in Congress. And I said, I have to ask you, you send me emails constantly giving the congressman's response to the issues of the day. How can you possibly get back to him that quickly to get his response? And he goes, I don't do that. I said, well, what do you mean? You're just sending me your own thoughts about these things? He goes, well, yeah. I know him very well. I know how he would think about this. And I used to work for a member of Congress who had to see everything I sent out under his name. He says it was ridiculous. We kept missing the Google wave. And the Google wave is serious. I get up every morning. It's the first thing I look at. What is cresting on Google, and how quickly can I write something to catch the Google wave? I wish I weren't doing that, but I am. And so is everyone who's trying to survive in the current media environment. Another question. When you talk to members of staff, what is motivating them? Well, where do they see their career? I too was very interested in the oversight function. And there are members of staff who are superb at oversight. They've done it for years. They know a whole lot. And they're like treasures. When one member leaves the Congress, this treasure is passed on to someone else who continues their excellent work. Well, these people are feeling kind of like dinosaurs these days. I mean, the young staffers, when you talk about what they want to do, they kind of want to get out. They want to go to K Street at one point. They're carrying college loans that would stagger anyone. $100,000 loans they've got to pay back. They can't afford to stay on the Hill as you might have 30 years ago, carefully working out an area of expertise. And so I actually did prepare some remarks, which I'd like to run through very briefly, but I think that the main point I want to leave you with is when you ask about Congress and foreign policy, you need to think about those 535 people and, to pick up the Mark Twain story that Don mentioned, the 5,000 ants on the log. Think about what's motivating the staff. Think about what a future looks like to them and what would give them an incentive to develop the kind of deep expertise that you need to be effective in foreign policy, as opposed to just coming up with a soundbite that's going to be good in a campaign-style environment. Well, there were individuals that made a difference in foreign policy. I was talking to the Senate Historic Office the other day, another place that has a wonderful institutional memory. For some reason, the House didn't do as good a job with their historical memory, but the Senate did. It prizes it. And we were talking about William Borah of Idaho, the great opposer, a member of the Irreconcilables. He said, America has risen to a position where she is respected and admired by the entire world. She did it by minding her own business. He opposed the League of Nations, as Woodrow Wilson discovered, as many academics did when they came to Congress, that things aren't quite as he thought they might be. And then, just casually, Betty Coed, one of the many superb historians up there, said, you know, he never went home to Idaho. I said, what do you mean he never went home to Idaho? She said, well, Congress in those days only paid for a trip once a year, and it was hard to get to Idaho, so he never went home. And I thought, you know, that's a very interesting point, because members today go home all the time. And what difference does it make that they're constantly in their districts, as opposed to kind of developing relationships and, you know, pursuing kind of arcane interests with fellow colleagues here? I think it's significant. Arthur Vandenberg, Republican of Michigan, kind of the opposite of Borah, a monument to bipartisanship. He came up with one of the most wonderful cliches and oft-repeated phrases in the Senate, which is, politics stops at the water's edge. In other words, foreign policy is bipartisan. People don't say that quite as much anymore because there's not much that is bipartisan anymore. But he was the one that said it. He cooperated with the Truman administration in forging bipartisan support for the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO. Senator Fulbright, Democrat of Arkansas. Very interesting figure. I was talking to one of his aides once about what it was that prompted him as a Democrat to go against the president of his own party. Why did he get so interested in Vietnam and really learn a lot about it? He sponsored a whole series of hearings that literally educated the nation about that war. Have we had anything comparable to Iraq? I don't think so. To Afghanistan, certainly not. But Fulbright devoted tremendous effort to it, and he said, oh, it was very simple. I screwed up his plane reservations. I said, well, what do you mean? He was going to Australia, and instead of some direct flight, he ended up having to spend something like 28 hours on the plane, and he was miffed about it. And on the way out the door, he said, you get me a big, fat book to read. And so he handed him a history of Vietnam like that, and he read it. He read it 28 hours going out, he read it 28 hours coming back, and Pat Holt said, when he met him at the plane, Fulbright walked off the plane and he said, we can't win this war. He'd learned something about the country. We can't win this war. And started his hearings. There's always something like that. Anytime I ask a member of Congress who's interested in something besides the number one priority back in the district, it's something like that. Congressman Wolf, just talking to you the other day, and he said, well, I took a trip once to Africa, and the plane couldn't go back, and I ended up having to stay overnight, and then I was there for a week, and I never forgot those faces. And I talked to colleagues about it, and they can, I was convinced to go by a colleague, and I convinced other colleagues to go, and, it's faces, it's personal, it's knowing something, and it's having the time to do it. Which brings me back to Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana and Sam Nunn of Georgia, who together got interested in one of the most arcane issues possible. Is the Soviet Union actually dismantling, is Russia dismantling the Soviet Union's chemical and nuclear weapons? And if not, how can we help them do it? How can we get Congress to give money to them to do it? How can we track that it's being done? And, probably in retrospect, one of the more productive things that the Congress ever did on an issue like that. And yet Senator Lugar could well be in a very difficult fight for re-election, in part because of the identification and of the good work that he's done in foreign policy. So he's rapidly rebuilding ties back home. So this idea of people who have excelled in foreign policy somehow getting burned for it is one of the many factors that is a demotivating factor. So how do you build expertise in foreign policy without time, which they no longer have, and without travel, which is another question I'd like to know. How many members actually travel? Well, here again, I think the press can take credit for making travel look like a bad thing. We were the ones who convinced people that travel is really a junket. It's sort of wasting time. And I admit some of these, I think Tip O'Neill once had a famous outing to the Philippines that involved lots of golf on a great course. I mean, this does look bad. But the time spent actually in a place and seeing it and knowing it is important. But if you come back home and you're in a congressional environment where committee work no longer matters, where leaders take big issues out of committees and resolve them behind closed doors and then send them to the floor in a whipped vote where you can vote with the party or not, it's a demoralized atmosphere. And it's a factor, I think, that academics don't take into enough account, and journalists certainly don't. Now, when Speaker Boehner came in, he said that one thing he wanted to do was to restore Congress functioning as an institution and restore the committee process, and that the House would be out every 3 weeks or so, but it would be back for the full week, and the committees would be fully functioning. It's still dangerous to stand in front of the door at noon on Thursday. I don't know that this plan is working yet. But the question of how you develop expertise without time is an issue. Foreign affairs used to be an A-listing assignment. One of the things that struck me the most about Senator Kerry was when he first came to the Congress, he had a very unusual choice between the Appropriations Committee, which basically means you never have to raise a dime the rest of your life. People will be coming to you for money. People, would kill to be on Appropriations Committee. Or Foreign Affairs, where he had been, as David mentioned, one of the most remarked on witnesses ever before that committee. He chose Foreign Affairs. That's not a decision many people are making these days. In fact, I think effectively it's no longer an A-list committee. There isn't a crush to get on it, precisely because it plays so badly at home. Now, I want to talk about currency manipulation. I'm out of time, so let me just collapse this and hope that maybe this may be something we get into. Currency manipulation looks like an arcane issue, China currency. But it has such an impact on the current job situation in this country. Looking over this debate, I think you would see that. The U.S.-China Commission, formerly known as the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, was formed by Congress in October 2000 to give Congress regular updates on the China relationship. Is it good for the economy? Is it good? How are we doing militarily? And every year they produce an astonishing report that is ignored, as actually most astonishing commission reports are. If you look back to all the commission reports on terrorism before the 9/11 Commission, tremendous, very prescient, very accurate, completely ignored. Same thing with the China Commission. I just saw an advanced copy of their new report for which I had to pay $38.50 to get a Xerox. I don't know why. You can get it free very soon. Some quick facts. The U.S.-China deficit, U.S. trade deficit with China is now more than half of the U.S. trade deficit with the world. It's 12% now worse than it was last year. You saw from the Commerce Department last Thursday that our trade deficit with China is at a record high, $25 billion in 1 month alone. The U.S. imports roughly 640% more advanced technology products from China than it exports to China. Let me just read that again. The U.S. imports roughly 640% more advanced technology products from China than it exports to China. But one of the points that it took me a long time to realize was that a lot of that 640% is from American companies manufacturing in China and selling back here. A point that if you blink, you would miss it in the debate that just went on. Congress collapsed this whole debate over China currency and free trade to 2 days. That means that for journalists, it's impossible to cover because the Google News doesn't care about it after the vote. It has disappeared, it has vanished. And it doesn't care about it until just before the vote, so it disappears and vanishes too. So there are kind of 2 days to make, to write anything that would matter or to make a point that would matter, and then the attention has moved somewhere else. Back to this report. Foreign invested enterprises were responsible for 55% of China's exports and 68% of its trade surplus in 2010. That is, 2/3 of all those Chinese goods are in fact made by foreign companies operating in China and selling back to this market. Employment in the United States, this is a throwaway point, has nothing to do with my talk. I thought it was interesting. Employment in the United States would increase by up to 2.5 million jobs if China were to adopt an intellectual property system equivalent to that of the United States. China is huge. Now, are members of Congress going to spend time on it in an intelligent way? Let me just leave you with the problem I had last week covering this. On Tuesday, the Senate votes 63 to 35 to impose tariffs on nations for currency manipulation. China is not mentioned, but everyone knows who is meant here. China currency has been held at an artificially low level to give Chinese goods anywhere from a 3 to 23 to 30 to 40% trade advantage. I'm not sure which of those numbers are correct, but they were all cited in the debate. And at the same time, House leaders in the run-up to the Senate vote announced that they were not going to bring that bill to the floor, no matter what the Senate did. So it became, in Senate terms, a free vote. In other words, you can vote on it knowing that there will be no outcome, or a symbolic vote. The Club for Growth, one of many conservative groups that weighed in on this, sent out letters before saying that any conservative that voted for this currency bill could expect to be scored on it. In other words, watch out what happens to your funding in the next election. Now, the House, just last year, voted overwhelmingly, 348 to 79, to vote for an almost identical bill on China currency. 99 Republicans supported that bill. There's a comparable bill right now in the House, sponsored by Congressman Levin. 63 Republicans have co-sponsored that bill. So we have more accurate information about where members actually stand on this foreign policy issue than you have for most issues. And yet, this bill will never come to a vote on the floor as a standalone vote. You saw it as... I have to stop for a minute. When I talk to my editors about this, they say, no one's going to read this. Their eyes will glaze over. I'm beginning to see this looking out here. I could be very bad at explaining it. But the issue needs explaining. And that's kind of not happening. All right, here's the most arcane thing. I'll just say it in 2 sentences, and then you can forget it. There was a motion to recommit on the floor last week. That means the Democrats get to bring up a standalone thing, and they tried to make it as punishing as possible to the other side. Republicans do the same thing. And what did they pick? The Senate bill on China currency, which has 63 Republicans already endorsing. Only 4 of them voted for it on the floor. Now, that could be because if they'd voted for it, it would have killed a free trade pact that was very important to Republicans. But it's part of this gridlock/gamesmanship that is crushing the life out of this Congress and about any motivation for any member to spend time on the issues that we're talking about. And that, I think, is the most discouraging aspect of all. Can Congress be a force for good? Of course it can. Foreign policy affects Americans. They may not be aware of it, but it does. And China trade most emphatically affects Americans. One of the interesting studies that many members referred to in the very brief debate they had about this was by the Economic Policy Institute, which somehow developed numbers of jobs lost to the China trade in each congressional district and in each state. And that is the kind of boiling down of data you need to even make a dent in a Congress that is so fixed now on what it needs to do to maintain its own majority, to follow the leadership's guide on that, and to play a politics at a level of gridlock that I think historically is going to stand as unrivaled. By previous periods, certainly, but by subsequent periods, it can't continue to be this bad. And something that can't continue to be this bad won't. And that's the happy thought that I use to inspire myself to get up every morning. But I can tell you, if journalists are discouraged about it, members of Congress even more so. There are some excellent people that are considering leaving the institution precisely because the work that they do in committee goes nowhere. And because it's a demoralizing time. It's better to be there when Woodrow Wilson was leading the U.S. into its period of being a kind of dominant economic and world power. Members of Congress today are at a time when that is becoming less and less the case. It's not so much fun.
Thank you. Gail, even though some of that is depressing, I think the fact that you have a sense of humor keeps us a little bit lighter, and you've got the Bluebird of Happiness suit on there. So, but I was just thinking that one thing that I like to do before we engage the audience in the Q&A is to give our first two presenters any chance for follow-up on what the last two said. But Senator Sununu, I didn't mention the introduction, not only has an engineering degree from MIT, but he also has a business degree from Harvard. And notwithstanding those degrees, he probably is still trying to figure out how to fix Congress. But at least he was there for a while. He knows how it operated then, how it's operating now. But I was just wondering whether you had anything to say in the way of a follow-up as to some of these dilemmas that Congress faces in looking at foreign policy issues.
Well, on a small practical issue, the question of an importance of oversight was brought up, and there are a number of staff members that are good at oversight. I think that's important, that's valuable. But the real question is, are there members who are willing to put throw themselves into the process of oversight? And reform and oversight are tough. They're far tougher than just writing a new piece of legislation, even in the foreign policy arena. So one of the problems we have, one of the reasons you need oversight, you need reform in the ways, for example, economic development is provided around the world, is because over time, just like on the domestic side, we've endured a very accretive process. So people have good ideas about, well, we should be thoughtful in the way economic development funds are used. If we build a school, it should meet safety codes and maybe environmental codes and maybe local labor laws. And conceptually, these are all good ideas, but in practice, they may make it just about impossible for the development assistance to actually make a difference on the ground. And the only way to rectify that situation is for some member, to set the priority of let's go look carefully at all of the different kinds of restrictions and limitations that we've placed on development assistance, and how do we make the system work better? Not more liberal or more conservative or left or right or Republican or Democrat, just make it work a little bit better so that we don't have to read about stories of funding being wasted around the world and not being used for its intended purpose. Oversight and reform is really tough. But it's important and valuable, and the only way it gets done is by the members actually setting the priority from the top down, and believe me, the staff will follow.
Before I yield to David, I just make one comment, and that is when the Republicans took over the first time around in 1995, they prided themselves in the fact that they cut committee staff back by 1/3. They felt it was too bulky. They cut it back from about 1,800 to 1,200 people. One of the things Republicans regretted a few years later was that they had taken away a lot of good oversight committee staffers, and so they were less able to do the oversight than their predecessors, at least on paper, were. And so that was something that was noted even by the Republican members. David?
Well, I would just say that I think both the Senator and I talked a little bit about what motivates members to be involved in foreign policy issues, and I think you raised a very good question about what motivates staff in the end. And sort of hearkening back to this book I did on Tommy Corcoran, who was really the first great super lobbyist in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, and a little bit in the 1980s. Not that much has changed, except that the staffs have gotten a lot bigger. But staffers are there for very different reasons. And, the Foreign Relations Committee, for example, is not a place where you can easily sort of segue into a K Street job. You don't go from working on developmental issues to making $1 million in a law firm downtown. It just doesn't work that way. So one of the things I really enjoyed about it was that it was the personal experiences of people that brought them to the committee and that kept them there. And there were some just extraordinary staffers who had been there for a long time, who really believed in what they were doing and believed in a purpose. There's a whole another group out there who see this as it's punching a ticket. You do 2 years on the Hill, and then you do go downtown. But and that can be, it shouldn't be a huge surprise that there's a lot more money in the defense industry. The defense budget's a $600 billion, $700 billion defense budget. Foreign aid or foreign assistance, $50 billion. So you find more people who are willing to cash in. But that doesn't mean, again, that you don't find on the Armed Services Committee folks who have been there for a long time, deeply believe in what they're doing, deeply believe in the security of the country, and are willing to to work for not much money and could make a lot more money. So I think I'm not sure that anything has changed too much in that regard. I think people have different reasons for being there.
I did a very unscientific study recently because I was reading Roll Call, which I happen to be a columnist for, but they have every once in a while a fabulous 50 list of the top staffers on the Hill that is done sort of informally by asking different people, who do you think are the most powerful staffers, the House and the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, and so on. And what caused me to do this little study was I noticed that most of the people on this list now are either leadership staff with the Republican or Democratic leadership or committee or campaign staff for the Republican or the Democratic campaign committees, and a smaller and smaller percentage are actually committee staff. And so I asked Roll Call, could you give me from 1981 a comparison of your top 50 list? And the best they could do is come up with like 86 and 87, but it's really turned around completely, whereas back in 1986 or 87, it was about 60% committee staff were considered among the most powerful and about 40% of leadership staff, and now it's just the opposite, that committee staff are considered less and less powerful. More and more leadership staff are up there on that list because of for one thing, what Gail mentioned, people are looking at those that can man the war rooms. These are people that are politically astute, can help their parties get their members reelected and so on, but that's where the real staff growth has come from, and that's where you got the best and the brightest staff presumably now working is with the leadership on these political issues and not so much on the policy issues.
Don, you're the only one in Washington I know that would have thought of asking someone to do those numbers.
Well, my name was on that list in the old days, so it was all vanity. But
I wonder if their list of the 50 most beautiful people gets more reads than the list of the most.
I was once told I had the perfect face for radio, but let's go to the audience for questions here. We do have microphones, so please wait for the microphone and identify yourself and your affiliation, and we'll have questions and comments. Not everybody at once. Let's start right here with a former Wilson Center staff person and now a renowned political scientist in his own right.
Thanks, Don. I'm Jordan Tama. I'm a professor at American University. And my question is, looking to the future, I think one of the historical trends with Congress has been that it's assertiveness in foreign policy has been greater at times when we have not been in a major war or have not been in a moment of crisis. I think there's been a cycle of increased and decreased congressional assertiveness based on how prominent wars or crises have been in current American foreign policy. And so now we seem to be entering a time of greater inwardness, and I'm wondering whether that might suggest that the president's dominance of foreign policy might recede in the coming years relative to the past decade, say.
Let's ask Mr. Lindsay first on that one. You noticed any trends in this? As to one of your books, I think, is called the Resurgence of Congress in Foreign Policy, or something of that title. One that you edited.
Congress Resurgent.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was written, or it came out, I guess, in the mid-1990s, at a time when congressional interest in, or congressional activism in foreign affairs began to surge. I mean, I think that the dynamic that Jordan pointed to exists. That is, you think of sort of the ebb and flow of power, influence, or contest across Pennsylvania Avenue is more or less tied to the country's perception that it's under threat, and secondarily to the expectation that the president's policies are working. So after World War II, you had more congressional involvement in foreign affairs. By the time you get to the early 1950s, there's a growing sense of the Soviet threat, and you begin to see much less criticism of the White House from Capitol Hill. This is the period that Arthur Schlesinger later referred to as giving birth to the imperial presidency. And then the imperial presidency would stub its toe, so to speak, over Vietnam when people became convinced that the president's policies had made the country less safe, and that the country was actually, or the international environment was safer than it otherwise had been. On that, I have to just put a little footnote on Gail's remark about Senator Fulbright. Well, Senator Fulbright was critical in 1966 in holding the Vietnam War hearings, which were sort of the first break with Lyndon Johnson's presidency. He was also the floor manager of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which included one of my favorite exchanges on the floor when a member, senator, raised the question, but doesn't this give the president the authority to go to war? And Fulbright said, yes, but I don't think that's what he's going to do. And as a legal matter, it doesn't matter what you think of the bill will do. It matters what the bill does. And I think that was sort of the significant thing there. But yes, as you go through, as the country feels more secure, you're going to get more congressional activism. Partly it's a matter of politics. That is, you can do it and not worry about getting in trouble. But also, there's a sense that you're not endangering the country in the way you would. And again, the dynamic repeated itself after September 11. Where the country rallied around President George W. Bush. His public approval ratings went into the 90s, the highest they've ever been. They were on a fairly high basis for a sustained period of time. And as you get to October of 2002, as the administration was pushing for a vote to authorize the Iraq War, many Democrats simply wanted to put the issue behind them and move on to other things. Because they realized this was not going to work to their advantage, and a lot of the sort of, quote, smart political money argued that Democrats, particularly those interested in running in 2004, would probably be best to get on board and move on.
Anybody else want to comment on that? I cut my eye teeth around in the 70s. I came on right the day that Nixon was inaugurated in '69. And what I noticed then was Congress was getting more and more active in foreign and military affairs. As Nixon was winding down the war, they became more activist. And so when I was looking up all these great amendments, and I was asking, one of the questions I put on David's sheet was, why don't the giants bestride the earth anymore the way they used to in the Senate? We had Cooper Church and McGovern-Hatfield amendments and so on and so forth. But these all occurred after Johnson had left office and Nixon was in and was actually winding down the war when we started to have challenges not only on Vietnam and Cambodia and things like that, but also on military weapons systems even. And so Congress was very activist during that period, and I think that's what a lot of people refer to the resurgent Congress. It's after the country had grown war weary and was no longer popular, and therefore members could assert themselves more and not feel as at risk politically. Maybe that was my observation anyway.
Oh, quite clearly. If you look at public opinion data by the fall of 1967, the public had begun to sour on Vietnam, in large part because their expectation was this would not last long, and we kept going in further and further. And you have the Tet Offensive in early 1968, and from the vantage point of the Johnson White House, Congress had already begun to be too critical, or had become much more critical of its policies. It's one of the reasons why LBJ chose not to run for re-election.
The foreign policy experts might correct me if I'm wrong. Gail mentioned the quote from Vandenberg about the politics stopping at the water's edge, and of course, as you point out, it's never really been the case, but there's always some politics involved. But was he also the one that was responsible for the quote about Congress wants to be in on the takeoff as well as the landing?
No, that was Lyndon Johnson, who one of the reasons for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was that Johnson wanted to avoid a repeat of what had happened to Harry Truman, and he thought that Harry Truman made a mistake by not going to Congress in getting congressional authorization. So there was actually at the Pentagon sort of a standing resolution already drawn up, and LBJ calculated that would protect him against people changing their mind later on that it wasn't such a good idea. It turned out that people can vote for a piece of legislation and still change their mind, Senator Fulbright being first and foremost, and hence LBJ complained that he had gotten them in on the takeoff and foreign policy, so they would be there on any crash landings, but he forgot to factor in the parachute.
David?
Well, just along those lines, I remember reading from episode from 1962, the transcripts of President Kennedy consulting Everett Dirksen, the minority leader, about the nuclear test ban treaty, and Dirksen actually providing political advice to his president about how they could get this thing passed. I mean, can you imagine that happening today? And I don't have either answer why it's deteriorated so significantly and how to bring it back. But maybe Senator Sununu does.
Well, I actually have a slightly different viewpoint. We all like to think that the times we live in are completely unique or different, or certainly not as good as the good old days. But I think in many respects, we're reliving the same challenges and debates, and talking about the same questions that they were talking about in the 70s or the 50s or the turn of the century. And in the 60s, when the test ban treaty was probably taking place, they probably thought this is so polarized and fractious, and there's so much tension in the country right now over civil rights or other things. Why couldn't this be more like the turn of the century when we had this wonderful academic, Woodrow Wilson, and things were much more genteel and thoughtful, even in the debates and even when you had disagreements? Look, there are two things, I think, that really affect whether you're in a surgent time of congressional activism or not. It's not that, and I think it's one, politics. Right? The members think that this is an issue that their constituencies care about and are acting on and are voting on. And the second are people. Do you have members who are either in a position of leadership or who simply have the will and the wherewithal to drive an issue to completion? So first, with regard to the politics, those politics can be a factor whether the country's divided and you're a Democrat trying to make the president look bad on funding the Contras or mining harbors in Nicaragua, and you see political opportunism to rally your base or to rally voters in America because they're starting to turn against what might be viewed as interventionism in Central America, or the politics can favor unity. In the fall of 2002, when the country is unified, we feel strong, we feel committed, we feel concerned about the national security threat, and members are engaged and active in formulating the policy and the legislation that responded, in effect, to 2000, to 9/11, in the way of everything from new national security powers, the Patriot Act, which was passed in a very unanimous way back in 2001, and I ended up filibustering 4 years later in 2005 and winning the filibuster. Who thought that would happen? But so that activism is driven by politics, but it's not necessarily politics of unity or politics of division. It can be either. It depends whether the member sees the opportunity to rally the constituency, and second, the individual. So we talk about a Vandenberg on the one hand or a Bora on the other because they decided this is what they wanted to do. This is what they would commit themselves and throw themselves into. And in the same way, in 20 years or in 30 years, or even today, we talk about a Senator Lugar or Sam Nunn or John Kerry or John McCain, people who spent a great deal of their time working on foreign policy and national security issues. And sometimes you agreed with them, sometimes you disagreed with them, but there's no question that they were the kind of legislator and policymaker and at times advisor to presidents that really had an impact in the outcome.
Very good. Now we've got questions. All right. Let's go with the gentleman on the aisle first and then the one in front of him after that.
Good afternoon. My name is Sergio Ceballos. I'm an intern with a congressman at the House of Reps. And my question is, I've been an intern for 3 weeks, so I've had the opportunity to go to a lot of foreign affairs, oversight committees, and at times I was shocked because, I don't know, sometimes the congressmen weren't as interested in whatever topic was being debated. And at times I was like, oh, okay, this congressman knows what he's talking about. He's actually studied or whatever. But that's why I came here today, too, because it's a very interesting topic to talk about today. But my question was regarding lobbies and what effect do lobbies have over congressmen as far as pushing or as far as foreign policy, as far as pushing certain policies that they think maybe should be, that are morally important to push. And sometimes I feel like lobbies hold them back. They have an influence over them, and I was wondering if you can talk about it.
Very good question. That's something we haven't covered. We talked about political bases and constituents, but we haven't really talked about the interest groups here in Washington that obviously represent constituents and people that are members of parties, but they have specific interests. And how much of an influence do they have on the foreign policy process?
Well, I guess I should start having been lobbied, so to speak, one way or another on a whole host of issues during the 12 years I was in Congress. I would say the things that I mentioned in my remarks, background, your perspective, the district you represent, the constituencies that are active there, all of those things are more important. There simply aren't many nationally organized lobbies on foreign policy issues that are very sort of effective one way or another. But to the extent that there are, like any other lobby in the country on domestic issues, on economic issues, on regulatory issues, their effectiveness varies from member to member. Oftentimes they're most valuable simply as just a source of information. You know, there's going to be someone on both sides of just about every issue. So if someone is actually an effective lobbyist, they'll probably come into your office and tell you the pros and cons of a particular issue. And then finally, lobbying groups tend to look toward or flock to members that already share their perspective to start with. So, you know, again, on domestic issues, if you're from an energy-producing state, you're probably going to be working on a lot of issues that energy lobbyists on one side or another are concerned about. If you're on the Foreign Relations Committee, you're probably going to end up visiting with lobbyists or lobbying groups or constituent groups on a lot of foreign policy issues. So a part of it is a self-select process rather than walking into some member's office and thinking you're going to, persuade them to change their mind in a half-hour conversation.
David, what was your perspective, both from working on the senator's personal office and in the committee staff?
Well, I met with a lot more lobbyists when I was on the personal staff than I did when I was on the committee, and it's just as Senator Sununu said. I mean, the kinds of groups that tended to come in when I was on the committee were, they they had foreign policy agendas, but it was a different approach to somebody that wanted a change in the tax law or wanted an appropriation. It was very, very different. It was much more sort of policy based. They tended to be, there were a lot of nonprofits. Now, that's not to say that there weren't some corporate interests as well. Sure, there are who have interests in different countries. But it was not, it was one of the most sort of gratifying things about being on the committee was that I didn't have to meet with lobbyists all the time.
Jim Lindsay?
I would just offer up the observation that lobbyists are more effective the narrower the issue. Lobbyists are more effective the fewer the number of people who care about their issue, for the simple reason that the American political system is relatively open. It has many what political science like to call veto points where things can be stopped. So if you're lobbying for a big issue that gets lots of people excited, I don't know, trade relations with China, Afghanistan, what have you, you're going to be hard-pressed as a lobbying organization to get your agenda through because there are lots of other organizations who are opposed to you who are going in and talking to Senator Sununu, other senators or members of Congress making a different set of arguments. But if you're going in and arguing for making a change in U.S. aid policy toward name a country in Africa and there's no one else arguing against it, and you're more likely to be able to have an impact. And again, general rule of lobbying is if you are unopposed, you're more likely to win than if you are opposed.
I noticed on the House Foreign Affairs bill it was just reported that there is a separate title on individual countries, and there are about 17 sections, each one dealing with a different country, very minute provisions, but it's very interesting to go through that list. Gail, anything that you've observed on the influence of lobbyists on foreign policy matters?
I used to think that the most influential lobbyist was the one that kind of came to the member, and I was talking to a member about this once, and he said, no. It's the most powerful lobbyists are the ones that don't have to come to you. You already know what they need and how significant they are. So I've almost there is so much that we don't know about the lobby process because, for one thing, campaign finance is now so opaque. One of the other sad things about Congress, I wrote a lot of enthusiastic pieces about campaign finance reform, and it seems that every step Congress has made to make money in politics more transparent has had precisely the opposite effect. We now know a great deal less about a great deal more money in politics, which is I think, a critical element. The other thing that has surprised me, too, is how often lobbies are not of one mind. I mean, the National Association of Manufacturers, if there was ever a group that should have views on China currency, that's it. And they don't. They're too divided to have a view on it. Their board tends to be people who themselves manufacture in China. They think China currency is fine the way it is. But all those little manufacturers who aren't big or savvy enough to move to China are getting clobbered by it, and they wanted the association to go in another direction. They couldn't make a decision, and so they didn't. I suspect that is a lot more likely than you think. One of the things House Republicans tried to do when they took back the House for the first time in 42 years, I guess, in 1995, was something called the K Street Project. Caution to ambitious politicians. If you're ever going to try something like that, don't give it a name that's so memorable as the K Street Project. But the idea was that they would literally go to all the lobby firms and say, Democrats have been controlling this place for 42 years. It's not surprising that your main lobbyists are ex-Democratic staffers. If you don't change and start getting Republican staffers, you're not going to have access to us. And this, it may not have been as blunt as that, but that was the sense. You've got to start hiring Republicans if you're going to have access to us. And the argument that they made was, you've got Democrats representing you, big corporation, but Republicans are actually closer to your interests. You ought to have Republicans representing you on Capitol Hill. And that was another angle I hadn't thought about. I mean, what if the lobbyist, that is the person who's paid to lobby Congress, is out of sync in some important way with the constituents that are paying the lobbyist? That happens a lot more than I thought it does. So it's a good question to which there isn't any clear, good answer.
Okay. We had one in front of the fellow just asked a question there in the white shirt. Your name, please.
Hi, Jason Froelich from the U.S. Asian Institute. What I wanted to ask, well, this is really loud. What I wanted to ask was, in terms of the background of people who become congressmen and congresswomen, is it that their professional background affects how they deal with foreign policy? So, for example, I don't think that too many people ever who, let's say, had a PhD in international relations or some kind of foreign policy-related field ever would become a member of Congress. And rather, the kind of people who become congressmen a lot of times are maybe businessmen or maybe lawyers, prominent lawyers. And so, which maybe they only deal with domestic issues in their normal lives before they became part of Congress. And so how does that affect them in once they get into their careers?
Senator?
Well, I don't know what value. I don't know that there would necessarily be an extraordinary value to having someone with a PhD in foreign relations in Congress. There would be no more or less value than having someone with a PhD in economics. Right? That's nice, good education, but it really depends how they can translate that knowledge into practical value, crafting legislation, understanding public policy, and understanding the impact that public policy has. I think as a matter of course, what we need in Congress generally are people with more practical experience working in the real economy, both domestically and internationally. So someone with business experience with a company that did importing and exporting, that was shipping product overseas or manufacturing overseas and bringing that product here, that understood the real ramifications of a number of the issues that have been mentioned, right? Intellectual property protection, the impact of stronger versus weaker currencies and whether or not those currencies are manipulated by governments, labor relations and labor law, and the disparities we might find between labor and environmental laws, and whether or not that has a material impact in their ability to succeed here. So it's really practical experience that's missing. And in the case of the foreign policy questions that we're talking about, do they have practical experience working with, interacting with individuals, companies, and institutions around the world? I think, and is generally that is something that's missing in Congress.
David, you had a law degree and a degree in law and diplomacy from Tufts. And how relevant was that to your work on Capitol Hill? Did you find it very useful?
No. But what it was it was a demonstrated interest that I'd had for a long time, and it wasn't that it wasn't useful. It was useful. And I think that's, Senator Moynihan went to Fletcher, and so he had that sort of demonstrated interest. But I think people become interested in these issues for a variety of reasons. Chris Dodd was in the Peace Corps in Central America. That's why he embraced the Foreign Relations Committee for a number of years. And I think, just as Senator Sununu said, I think there are people from business backgrounds that are sort of interested in it from that point of view. So there are a lot of different reasons why people come to the table.
Yeah, one of the rare exceptions is Howard Wolpe of Michigan, who had his Ph.D. and taught international relations in Michigan and was a specialist on Africa, came to the Congress, soon became the chair of the Africa Subcommittee, was defeated for re-election after several years in the Congress, and ended up in the State Department on their Africa desk, and then he came here to the Wilson Center, ran the Africa program, and now he's back at the State Department on the Africa desk. But so there you could see a clear line, and he was a very, very good member of Congress, too, represented his constituents well, but eventually a Republican beat him in an election. Anything else anyone wants to add on that?
Well, since I have a PhD in political science,
spent some time in government,
about
too.
to declare your candidacy?
I feel I should stand up for members of my profession, not people who have economics PhDs. However, I am reminded of what William Buckley once said, that he'd rather be governed by the first 200 names in the Boston phone book than by the Harvard faculty. Though perhaps it's because he was a graduate of Yale College. I think that what Senator Sununu and what David have just said is spot on. It matters more people's practical experience, their ability to mobilize others, than knowing what it is that Hans Morgenthau wrote, or being able to do a calculation that would make the Nobel Prize Committee in Economic Sciences happy. What I do think is notable when you look at membership in the Senate and in the House is the change composition. Many more lawyers. I don't know if that's particularly to our advantage. Also, many fewer people who have served the United States military, which has often been remarked upon. A number of social scientists have explored these issues, trying to determine what difference it makes in terms of what Congress actually does. And there's no clear evidence that it does much of anything, and that what members do is constrained or driven by lots of other factors that are more important, like your party, your constituency, the events of the day, and what have you.
Thank you. Something else that William Buckley said, you remember he ran for mayor of New York City, and somebody asked, if you're elected mayor, what's the first thing you're going to do? And he said, demand a recount. That has nothing to do with foreign policy. Let's go to the gentleman here. And then I'll get you on this side.
Hi, Ryan Jacobs. I'm an intern on the House Armed Services Committee. And on a side note, I will say that I do actually want to serve on a committee one day and actually do effective work. So hopefully that happens. My question, though, veers into the lobbying stuff that we were talking about earlier. I think we kind of skirted off the topic. And there is always that kind of argument within foreign policy area that there is a certain Israeli lobby, that there is an influence on U.S. policy towards Israel, and that it's developing, and that's it's maintaining a relationship. That is perhaps a good relationship, but I would like to ask if we could expand on that dynamic, if members on the panel could expand on the dynamic between the lobbies, even though there are divergent lobbying interests within the Israeli lobby. And my second question, sorry if I'm taking too much time, is just in regards to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Serving on the Armed Services Committee, I find that there's a lot of, it's the House Foreign Affairs Committee. They don't really get any money. They don't appropriate as much. Is it important to have that support base? So for the Armed Services Committee, they have a defense industry support base. Now, where is that support base for the Foreign Affairs Committee? And if there isn't one, how do you develop one? Because, of course, the Foreign Affairs Committee does important work that needs to be recognized. Thank you.
Any brief comments on either of those questions?
Well, I've actually visited with some people recently that asked in almost those precise terms the second question, which is there any constituency for foreign assistance, foreign policy? How do you go about, would you go about organizing one here in the United States? And there's simply no two ways about it. You run up against the wall that the public at large, when asked about issues or priorities that they have for their representatives, put foreign policy and economic assistance way down on the list. So there are just natural hurdles and challenges. With regard to AIPAC, which is one of the...
Tell what that stands for.
The American Israel Political Action Committee, which lobbies on issues that they feel are important to Israel and the greater Middle East. They've been around longer, they're better organized, bigger membership, and sort of by definition that means they're likely to be a more effective lobby, certainly one that's better known with members. And it goes to everything from local organizing locally in grassroots and having people at the local congressional level or state level build relationships with the member, reach out to them on a regular basis, whether they're asking for legislation or not, all the way to the national organization efforts, which involve board meetings in Washington and big public affairs conferences and the like. To the extent that they're effective, it has a lot to do with their size, history, and scope. To the extent that their success could be replicated by other groups, I think the answer is almost certainly yes, because there are many different constituencies and groups in the country that, and as you point out, many different groups, even within those that are focused on foreign policy related to the Middle East and Israel. that have divergent viewpoints. So there's certainly a lot of opportunity for shared perspective.
We have time for one more question. And Frances, did you have it? I wanted to ask our co-host first of all. If not, let's give the microphone to the gentleman next to her, Jeff Biggs.
Don, thank you very much, and Francis, for a wonderful topic and a superb panel. One area of the world did not come up in this, which I was surprised about, and that is the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which seems to reflect a lot of what was said, because there have been some dramatic changes that have been taking place. For a number of years, we could rely upon Egypt and Turkey to play a supportive role in negotiation between the two parties. And now, in fact, Congress is thinking about eliminating entirely any assistance to the Palestinians, and in the process, seemingly to give up the U.S. role of being an honest broker. Now, I don't know what replaces that role, but would you guess that this is a result of politics or well-thought-out foreign policy?
That's above my pay grade. Anybody here?
There is a very interesting piece in CQ Weekly on this exact issue, much more detailed. There was a spike of interest in AIPAC after a book by two Harvard professors basically saying this was the most powerful lobby in the United States. I don't know if they said on earth, but I think they could have. Very strong book. And for a while, AIPAC kind of really disappeared in terms of other groups popped up, kind of replacing them for a time. I mean, they were still obviously there, but they deliberately took a less strong profile and in a funny way were replaced by Eric Cantor, the first Jewish Republican in the House, not ever, but in the current House, who did some extraordinary things. I mean, just after the election, meeting with Netanyahu, the first time an opposition member had met with, a head of state like that, and it's shaping up as a very important issue in the 2012 election. It's a wedge issue. You could potentially drive a wedge through a strong Democratic constituency by, in effect, saying, I am more pro-Israel than you are. And that, I think it has enormous implications. You've already seen the president back off. If you compare what he's saying now with what he said in his Cairo speech, there's a striking difference. And how did that happen? And was that a process of learning on his part, or was it running up against very strong opposition, both from AIPAC, but also from a Republican, House Republican group that led by Eric Cantor that is taking a role that hadn't been taken before on that issue, much, much stronger. It's going to be interesting to see, but I predict that this will emerge as an important factor in the 2012 election, and it's giving the president a lot of difficulty because what he said in Cairo is on record, and having to kind of link that with what he's now saying risks the problem that Senator Kerry ran into of appearing to flip-flop or give up on commitments you initially ran on and made.
Senator Sununu, I'll let you have the last word, and then we can take this conversation across the hall to a reception in our boardroom.
Well, one observation about some of the issues raised, and it underscores the suggestion I made, which is you want to cultivate members of Congress and encourage members of Congress to understand these issues related to foreign policy during the quiet times, because you never know when they're going to be needed. And we've seen uprisings and transition in power in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, other places in the Arab world through the Arab Spring, and it's good that members of Congress, I think, are paying more attention to these areas, thinking about what are the national security ramifications for the United States, what are our national interests, should our perspective be on encouraging this process, but at the same time, I would want the members of Congress who are going to be leading that debate to have been thinking about, listening, understanding the culture, the politics, the economics in Northern Africa, in the Middle East, 2, 3, 5, and 10 years ago. You don't want them to suddenly come to the issue and need a crash course and a crash education. So that's exactly, and 5 and 10 years ago, there probably weren't many people that would say, well, gee, I think you're going to have the mass protests in Egypt and a transition. I was in Egypt about a year before the protests and the transition, and talked to quite a number of real business people, not necessarily political people, about how they felt about the economy and the politics in the process, and even they didn't really see it coming. So I think there's a lot to be said for, if nothing else, you're not necessarily going to make it a huge political winner. You're not going to develop grassroots constituencies at home for getting involved in foreign policy, but you can help create opportunities for members to think and talk and discuss these issues here domestically in a way that enriches them, enriches their thinking, develops an understanding and a knowledge base so that it can put to good use during turbulent and critical times.
Thank you very much. Join me in thanking our panel.